Today is Sunday, May 29th, and this is William Michael of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. And I'd like to talk a little bit about a subject that came to mind as a result of two previous talks that I posted. The first, I talked about how Catholic schools can be fixed. Not that I think that anyone will do that, but if they were going to be fixed and stopped from self-destructing over time and becoming less and less useful to the Catholic community, they would need to adapt and make prudent use of available technology. And I talked about that in a talk, how to fix Catholic schools. And then I also discussed whether civilians should own guns in light of this Texas school shooting. And as I was thinking about those two talks, I realized that they go together and lead to another topic for discussion. As we deal with this school shooting, another public mass murder in America. And again, we don't want to exaggerate these events because we have to remember, like I said in that last talk, the news media is so omnipresent and immediate in their reporting that it feels like things are happening all around us because we're informed so quickly. And these things are spread out over the entire country, hundreds of millions of people, and we're talking about isolated events, but they still raise important questions because we don't want them to increase. We don't want them to become more common. And if we can take these as warning shots and think about what the causes of these problems are and try to avoid them, we'd be much wiser for it. But as I was thinking of those two talks, how to fix Catholic schools and whether civilians should own guns, I realized that these two talks are coming together. These two subjects are coming together and leading us to what I think is an obvious realization of a problem. What the problem is that schooling is simply unnecessary. Schooling is no longer necessary. Schooling creates a risk. It creates a danger. It creates a target for maniacs like the kind of people who carry out these school shootings. It creates the perfect target for some wacko young adult who wants to take out all of his hatred and anger on others. We gather all of the children from a geographical area together in one location, and we put them in a school with some playgrounds outside and maybe some sports fields where they're gathered together with a small number of adults. And as we all know, they're an easy target for anyone interested in doing harm, doing harm in a way that really causes suffering and grief, a cruel way to pay society back for usually bullying and mistreatment that the person receives while they're growing up. Again, through the schools, of course, maybe in their own homes, but usually through the schools. People ask, why do these shootings happen in schools? And the easy answer is because the shooters feel comfortable in these schools because they've been in them. And much of their bad experiences that has them so miserable in life came through their school experience. It's only reasonable that they take out their hatred and malice on a school community. These school shooters are able to purchase military-grade weapons and go to a school where they're supposed to be opposed by security guards or local police officers. But local police officers and security guards aren't prepared to get into a shootout with someone with military-grade weapons. It's one thing to imagine an old Western duel where two men face off with simple revolver handguns. But when you get the report that there's a shooter in a school and he's got two automatic rifles and he's got armor on and all these other issues, and you're a local police officer, you're going into a gunfight with a knife, relatively speaking. And so the options, we listen to people now talk about this. How can we deal with this? And we've got maniacs talking about having teachers carry guns. So now the teachers are now going to fight off armed gunmen in the schools. And it's ridiculous. But this is the sign of how ridiculous, really how absurd the idea is that we're going to protect children with guns. We're going to fight fire with fire, fight the sword with the sword. When you hear these people go on to the next suggestion, and now it's that the teachers should all have guns. And just imagine this idiotic situation. As if any teacher wants to have the responsibility to get into a gunfight. It's just so stupid, so ridiculous, so just unrealistic, and like I said in my talk about guns, really insincere. It's not serious. The people who say these things are not taking responsibility for the children. They're not speaking on behalf of the teachers. They're just talking stupid to spitefully continue with their political fantasy that continues to be humiliated by public events. Arm the teachers. Yeah, right. Then we talk about having police officers at the schools. Well, what are we going to do? We're going to send the children to school, bust them all in, then lock the school down, and have armed police officers prepared to face military-grade weapons around and inside the school? Or we're going to lock the school building down so that no one can enter the school? Well, what do the children do in these schools? I mean, we can make these schools safe like fortresses, but what do the children actually do in these schools? They get to school, the doors are locked, and then they stay in school all day long? So children don't go out on a playground, they don't get any exercise outside, they just get locked down inside of a building while armed police officers stand around the doors? That's a plan for school? How is that a plan for the education of children? It's a prison. And yet we listen to suggestion after suggestion, and it's like we're getting stupider and stupider with every suggestion. We're no longer thinking about the fact that we're talking about children and education. We're no longer thinking about the fact that we're talking about teachers and learning. Now we're simply designing schools that exist and are arranged for the sake of maintaining this right to freely purchase guns and other weapons by civilian people. That's what we're doing. We're now redesigning our children's schools, making them miserable, asking teachers to be willing to come to school armed like Billy the Kid and bear responsibility for the defense of the children in their classes in the event that an armed gunman enters the school, or locking the kids down inside of a fortress, all because Joe Bob wants to be able to go down to the local gun store and buy whatever weapons he likes. That's how stupid this position on gun ownership has become. And of course, they'll try to justify this by appealing to the Constitution, which doesn't allow for guns in the first place. You have to actually go to the amendments for the right to bear arms, and the right to bear arms is related to the right to form a militia, a well-regulated militia, not just a random men's club where they pretend to be soldiers, but an actual regulated militia, which we don't see anyone organizing regulated militias anywhere. We don't see any plan for actually regulating groups of citizen soldiers to act in a time of war. We're talking about recreational use of lethal weapons. And we're going to redesign the schools, turn the schools into bulletproof fortresses with armed teachers, so that American men can play with guns. And it's ridiculous, but I really don't want to talk about guns because that's an issue I talked about yesterday, and I really think it's just a matter of time before this silliness is dealt with in America. But what I want to look at is a bigger issue, which is that the modern experiment with compulsory public education, the construction of these massive school facilities to serve all of the children in a geographical area, the idea of this big school model where hundreds and hundreds of students are gathered together in one place for an education, is simply being exposed as an obsolete and undesirable model for the future. In 1950, if the majority of American children were going to be educated, they had to be gathered into some central location where educated people could offer them instruction, and it had to be face to face because there was no means of delivering instruction by any other means. And the school building was also where all of the books and supplies were kept for the students to access. There was a library at the school where all the children had access to books. All of the resources needed for learning were concentrated in one place, which was economical and efficient, and it made schooling available for the children. And the population was at a certain level in America where this was feasible. But as the population continues to grow and technology develops, we have to ask whether or not this gathering together of children into into concentrated locations is necessary, first of all, whether it's actually productive and useful, or whether it's actually an obsolete model that is not only ineffective as a school model, but is actually becoming a source of vulnerability in our communities. And this is on a number of different levels. The first vulnerability we're seeing in this development of school shootings, we're seeing the school as a vulnerable location where children are gathered together with no realistic way to protect them without, like I said, locking down the school and making it miserable. There's a vulnerability in this school model simply caused by gathering children together and creating a target for malicious individuals. But we've seen other problems as well. Over the past 3 years, we've watched as a pandemic, regardless of what you think about it, we've watched a pandemic and we've seen disease outbreaks in the past spread rapidly through these schools. These schools bring all of the children of the geographical area together, and if there's any disease or sickness anywhere in that geographical area, the school becomes a point of infection for everyone in that geographical area, allowing diseases to spread rapidly and pandemics to develop. It's a vulnerability not only for violence, but also for disease. If you attended a school growing up, you know what I mean. My kids were homeschooled. They've never been sick through their childhood. We've never gone to the doctor. We don't have kids throwing up in the house. We don't have kids with sore throats. We don't have kids with pink eye and other infections. We never, seriously, we never deal with the kind of sicknesses in my family that my family had to deal with all the time. I remember as a kid always having colds, getting the flu, having sore throats, having all kinds of stomach aches, diarrhea, throwing up. We were sick all the time. It was a normal part of life as school kids. And we were allowed to miss 10 days per year for the sake of sickness because kids are sick all through the year. And of course, sick days, when you're out and you have a doctor's note, those days are excused. So they don't even count as your 10 days. We had nurses in the schools with kids always in the nurses' offices, sick. The schools were centers for sicknesses and diseases. Is that really a good idea as the population continues to increase? Like I said, out in the country where I live, we don't get these diseases. We're not sick all the time. We don't have sore throats. We don't have colds. We don't get the flu. We don't have sick stomachs. We don't have these problems. My kids have been healthy their entire childhood. And I don't think families who live in congested areas where there are kids going to school and other activity in these centralized locations, I don't think they realize how much they're sick and how many sicknesses they're dealing with in their homes because of the congested living conditions of the suburbs and cities. I don't think they realize that everyone is not suffering with these problems. And spreading out actually keeps us healthier. So there are a number of different vulnerabilities that come with this idea of gathering children together in large numbers. We're not talking about Little House on the Prairie or a little Amish schoolhouse. We're talking about massive megacenters built with public funding where hundreds or even thousands of children are being gathered together. Now, if there were no such vulnerabilities, if it was actually a safe place, if it was actually a healthy place, that would be one thing. But when we consider these negative realities, and then we think about them in the present generation and ask ourselves, why are we even doing this? It makes even less sense. The arguments against schooling become even stronger. It's not good for academics to send kids to these schools. It's not necessary for academics. The schools don't actually do what they pretend to do. The schools pretend that 100 children are sent into the school and they go through the school program and they all receive a certain education that's explained on paper through the school curriculum, and then they all come out on the other end with that education. But that's not what actually happens. That's not what schools do. 100 children are sent to the school, and then the school sorts the children based on their perceived abilities, put them in different classes and different levels, and so on. They get different education based on this sorting of children. Then they go through the program and their behavior earns them grades which provide for further sorting. So after the initial sorting, students who score poorly and receive bad grades are demoted to lower levels and receive an inferior education at a lower level and are surrounded with inferior classmates. So they're further sorted, and usually the movement in these schools is from higher levels to lower levels. It's rare that students move from lower levels up to higher levels. Over time, more and more students are bumped down into lower levels. And by the time the schooling is finished, those 100 students come out with completely different experiences based on how they've been sorted. The students who do poorly, who basically don't learn anything, are blamed for their failures, or they're labeled as having some kind of defect because the school didn't work for them. The students who achieve great things are held up as examples of what the school provides. The trophies earned by the athletes are put in the school hallways. The awards earned by the top students are published in the school yearbooks and newspapers, even local papers and news. The school is responsible for nothing. It's not responsible for any outcomes. Unless we want to look at things like standardized testing, but the schools create their own standardized testing. So that's a very convenient little circle to deal with. If the scores are bad, we simply revise the tests and lower the standards and pretend it's necessary because of these kids. The schools are always free from criticism. And like I said, if the schools produced great outcomes, we might justify the dangers and vulnerabilities that they present to the children by saying, yeah, but they offer so much good. But that's not the case. That's not the case. They do not offer, they do not provide what they pretend they provide. And how they get away with this is a mystery. How they're allowed to simply sort kids, label kids, grade kids, push them all out with completely different experiences and say, we did our job, is a mystery to me. What other industry is allowed to do that? Only the schools. And they do it in an environment that, as I said, introduces dangers to our communities. But there's an even bigger reason to object. There's an even greater reason to object to the schools. Not only are they ineffective, not only are they sources of danger for our communities, but they're obsolete. They're unreasonable. When we consider the changes in our society that have been brought about by technology, the schools make no more sense. The schools were necessary because learning was local. Learning and education required a place. It was administered to students directly by teachers who had to be present to teach, to interact, to communicate, to assess student progress, and so on. Students and teachers had to be together. Resources were physical. The books, the chalkboards, and so on were physical and needed to be available in a particular location. But today, this isn't even true. This isn't even true in 2022. And we all know this. The schools even know this. And we can tell that the schools know this by what they're doing with the children. I have two goddaughters who live just next door to my family. They're my sister's children. She's a single mother, and her two daughters are sent to the local public school. They go to the public school, they're picked up by a bus every morning. They're sent to the local public schools. They're given Chromebooks or some kind of laptop computers. The schools are wireless, and the kids work with online programs in the schools. They're working on Khan Academy. They're working on IXL. They're using online resources in the school. The buses are driving the children from their homes to a central location where they open up laptops, sign on to the internet, and work with online programs. Everything that they're doing in the school, as far as academic work is concerned, is available to them at home. Khan Academy is available at home. IXL is available at home. All of the other resources they use are available at home. They're bused to the school building to work on the internet. What the schools are doing is irrational. And the schools know that. The teachers know that. The teachers of the classes know that there are teachers available on YouTube that are better teachers than they are. The teachers know that the quizzes they give in class could much more effectively be given and scored and recorded through an online quiz. The teachers know that the grading systems, the grade books that they use, are all available online. The teachers know that these things are available to the children at home. And therefore, any time that one of these tragedies or disease outbreaks occurs in the school, we have to ask the question, what the heck are the kids even doing in these schools? Why are they even there? Why do they even exist? And the answer to that is obvious. This public school system has become a colossal source of money-making for hundreds of thousands of adults. It is a massive moneymaker. It is a massive source of employment for adults, income for adults, and sales for all of the publishers and software companies and hardware manufacturers that mass produce products and services for these public schools. This has been an evil from the beginning, from the first development of the public school systems. The publishing industry was destroyed by public schooling because every publisher was no longer concerned with publishing the best books. All that they wanted to publish was the book or books that the public schools were going to purchase. Because the public schools were not only going to publish hundreds of them, but the public schools were going to pay for them with state funding, and they really didn't care what they cost. And that's why when you look at the prices of textbooks and you wonder, how in the world can a math book cost $120? How in the world can a history book cost $85? And I'm going to use it for 1 year, for one class? How is this even possible? Well, price is no object when a school district is simply sending government money to the publishers and ordering pallet loads of books that no one has to give an account for the costs of. The publishers want a piece of this market, and they don't publish the best books. They publish books for schools. Teachers' manuals, student textbooks, answer keys, student workbooks, and so on. The only type of teaching that's acceptable to the publishing industry since the beginning of the public school movement has been a teaching method that can be put into textbook format and mass produced. And so many thousands of historic, traditional sources of studies have been left out of print because they simply don't satisfy the book purchasers of the public schools or even the private schools. And so this schooling model has destroyed educational publishing. Everyone knows that what they're doing in the classroom is not necessary. I started the Classical Liberal Arts Academy in 2008 because I was a classroom teacher and I knew that what I was doing in the classroom was stupid. I stood there day by day in my classroom with all my students, thinking to myself, this could be done so much more effectively if this could be done so much more efficiently, so much more affordably if we did it like this. This course could be made so much better if we could do this. As a classroom teacher, I knew that what I was getting paid to do was great for me financially, but it wasn't what was best. It wasn't best for the children. It wasn't best for the parents. And as a Christian standing before God, I knew that I couldn't just continue doing this, knowing these things, because it made me money. And so in 2008, when I started the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, the reason why I did so was because I wanted to actually make available what I knew as a classroom teacher would be much more effective for students and more affordable for their parents. And that's why today the Classical Liberal Arts Academy offers over 100 online courses in real classical Catholic studies, and it costs only $10 per month to use. That's how ridiculous the modern schools are. My kids, and I'm talking about my actual children, my kids enjoy a relatively free education their entire childhood. They have access to hundreds of texts and resources in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, and they study freely their entire childhood. And then they're shocked when they go to college and they see what the colleges charge, not just for tuition, but for services, books, resources, and so on. It's insane. And they look at the quality and the rigor of the studies that they experienced in their homeschooling in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy for nothing. Free access to all of these resources. Year-round access to their studies. Day and night access to their studies. The ability to take quizzes, to retake quizzes, to constantly improve their scores, master their lessons, check all of their grades and progress reports anytime they wanted to, 24 hours a day, year-round. And then they enroll in college, and every move costs hundreds or thousands of dollars. And for what? An inferior course of studies. And my kids see how ridiculous the system is. And unfortunately, they have to deal with it because it's how our society unjustly is designed to operate. Again, for the sake of the people making money off it. There's no educational justification. There's no results-based justification. It's all for the sake of those working in it and supplying it with its resources. And fortunately, they have their tuition paid for by their military service, but they see the cost of books and how ridiculous it is. And it's even getting more ridiculous. I'll give you an example of how it's getting even more ridiculous, almost intentionally or spitefully ridiculous. My son Jonathan has no interest in mathematics. He's a criminal justice major. He's a military police officer in the Army. And he's required to, as part of his general education requirements for his degree, he's required to take a math class. So he takes an algebra class. There's a textbook required for this algebra class. Okay, no problem. It's a very expensive book, but here's the catch. The book is actually not in print. The book is online. So there's no actual book to purchase. But you still have to pay the price of a book to gain access to a digital textbook that you only have access to for, I think it was 12 weeks. The price stays the same. Somehow, miraculously, the price does not lower when one moves from a printed book where there are actual material costs. The price doesn't go down when we eliminate those material costs. The price stays the same, and your access to the book is temporary for a limited period. And the time limit for access to the book is less than the duration of the course. So it needs to be renewed near the end of the semester, or you'll lose access to the book while you're still working in the course. And what this has done is we can see in the example of how the school system, in order to keep making its money, makes use of technology, but it does so in a completely irrational and pointless way. Once the book is made available in digital format, there's no more cost of publishing. We don't need ink, we don't need paper, we don't need covers, we don't need printers. All of these costs of material, physically publishing books is eliminated by the availability of a digital textbook. And yet we're going to charge the same price as if nothing has really changed, negating all of the benefits of the technology. And then we're going to play games with subscriptions and exploit the children, the students, I shouldn't say children, the students who we already know don't have money for these things, but we can do so because we know that financial aid is available to those students and they can get the money through government loans, which are available to them through their colleges. So we exploit the financial aid system, we force the students to borrow money, and we render all of this improvement in technology useless. Nothing is actually improved. We can boast and flatter ourselves about the technology that we've made available, but we've undermined all of the benefits that it's made available to the students because we're going to continue seeking the maximum profit off of the material, even more profit, because like I said, the costs have been eliminated. And this is what these school systems and the industries that serve these school systems do to our kids. In the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, when we have access to a digital textbook, we make it available for free. That's the benefit of digital media. There's no publishing costs. That's the whole point. That's the great benefit of it. It can now be freely accessed. If I type an article and make it available in print form, I don't need to publish newspapers. I don't need to publish printed newsletters. I don't need to mail anything to anyone. I don't need to pay for postage or printing or envelopes or anything else. It's all free. And anyone sincerely interested in education will rejoice at the technology because it allows us to make so much available for free. But people won't let these benefits come through to the children and the families. They don't want the benefits to be realized. And so they set up payment gateways that make the children or the parents pay for things which do not need to be paid for. And their profit multiplies. Because now the revenue is the same, but the costs are a fraction of what they were. And this whole system that's developed is corrupt and unnecessary. And it's just part and parcel with this modern school system. The giant elephant in the room, when we talk about pandemics, remote learning, Zoom classes, school shootings, and we haven't even mentioned things like the costs of operating school buses in the information age, in the wireless digital communications age. We're fueling school buses to drive every single child to the school building where they sit on the internet. We haven't even talked about that nonsense. But when we hear of trouble in the schools, problems introduced into our communities through the schools, mass shootings, disease outbreaks, fights, and so on, drugs, and we could go on and on. The schools become epicenters for all of these social evils. And we pretend that there's no solution. We just have to keep doing it. Or we propose solutions that make the lives of other people miserable. Arm the teachers, the school teachers, arm the school teachers. That sounds great if you're not a school teacher. No school teacher wants that responsibility. Lock down the school buildings, surround them with armed police officers. No student wants to go to a school like that. And when we look and we ask, why are we even continuing to send our kids to these schools? We can't give a good answer. Why, have we overbought a house? Have we taken out mortgages and car loans that we can't afford without having everyone working? And we take the schools for granted because they allow us to pursue our own materialistic desires. And now that these schools prove to be problematic, we're going to leave the children vulnerable to these evils and prefer our houses and automobiles and health insurance and vacations. Really? This is like another form of abortion. Why are we aborting children? Because they interfere with our career plans? They diminish our income? They cause us discomfort? They interrupt our education? And so after we've given birth to these children, we're going to send them to these places that are becoming increasingly dangerous and destructive. And we're going to justify doing so because of our desire to keep working, or to keep our house, or to keep our cars, or our standard of material living and comfort. The day after the Texas school shootings, School buses showed up, kids hopped on the buses, and off they went. There was no second thought. No one was standing there talking about whether we should really be doing this or not anymore. Kids were just all off to school the next day. And when you watch these events covered in the news media, what always grieves me as a parent is it seems like when these events happen, when these tragedies occur, all of the parents and school staff members, even the local police and other groups of people, it's like they've all been trained how to carry out the post-tragedy rituals. They all know how to set up vigils for the dead, and they all have candles, and people are bringing gifts, and they're all exercised. It's like they're prepared for these tragedies. They've got their reactions and their post-tragedy vigils and rituals all planned and prepared because they've seen this on the news. They've seen these events. They've seen how people react to them, how people respond to them, and they're ready when it's their turn. They're ready. And it's just very odd, eerie really. It's creepy to watch these parents mourning and crying as if some inexplicable, unimaginable thing has happened that they've already watched again and again on television. They've seen it again and again. They've seen it so many times that they already know the routine for what the community's supposed to do afterwards. And they're just playing their role until all of the commotion is over and the camera crews leave and the kids go right back to school. That's what creeps me out about these events. We know they can happen. We know how they happen. We know the kids by whom these tragedies are likely to be carried out. We know who they are. The teachers know who they are when they're growing up. The parents know about their disturbing behavior. Their friends know about their disturbing behavior. Everyone keeps quiet because it's not convenient. They've got other stuff to do. We're not allowed to judge anyone. We're not allowed to say, this kid is a psychopath who needs to be locked up before he kills people. We know who these kids are. I went to school with one of these kids, a kid who ran over a cat with a lawnmower. We all knew who the kid was. The teachers knew who the kid was. These communities know who these kids are, and everyone ignores it because we're told we have to be nice and we can't judge and we can't criticize. We all have to be nice. And these red flags are visible in our communities. The same is true in other areas where there are sex abuse scandals and things like that. We know who the dangerous people are. We see red flags. And we don't do anything about it. There really isn't a mechanism set up for people in a community to do things about these red flags. This is one area where the church has really set a good example. I've been, as much as I can say that the priest abuse scandals are embarrassing and grievous, I can't tell you how many discussions I've had with non-Catholics where we're having a good discussion talking about theology and religion and morals and things like that, only to have the discussion pulled off the rails by the sex abuse scandals. But in spite of that, I'm very proud of how the church has dealt with the problems and has aggressively and proactively sought to prevent them from happening again. You go to any diocesan website, you go on the USCCB website, even most parish websites, and there will be links and information on the front pages of the websites that say, if you have any suspicion of abuse, report it here. And it can be anonymous. The church is taking proactive, preventive measures to avoid repeating these problems. Because I've worked as a volunteer for the church, and I know many of you likely have as well, I've had to take the child safety training courses that the diocese requires, and I think they're great. They're great because they're preventive, they're proactive, and we take the risk of offending someone for the sake of avoiding the trouble. We take the risk of embarrassing someone in order to protect the children. If someone is acting inappropriately, and we're taught the kinds of things that are inappropriate, if someone is acting inappropriately, we're told to report them. And the worst case scenario is that we find out that everything was okay, and there's a little bit of an embarrassment or maybe some upset emotions, feelings got hurt, things like that, but the kids are safe, and that's more important. If you're in a room with a closed door with a child, you're acting inappropriately. We've just had sex abuse scandals all through the church. They're in schools all over the place. And we've made it clear that we're not going to enter into any situations where there even could be a hint or suspicion of trouble. And the church has made it clear that if you find someone not respecting these guidelines, report them. And that's exemplary in the church. But in community at large, we don't seem to have similar programs in place where we establish manners in our society and say, it's not appropriate for you to do this or that in these situations. It's not appropriate. Posting pictures of yourself with weapons, posting pictures of yourself dressed like you're some kind of military person when you're not in the military. You want to dress like a soldier? Go join the army and do some good. You want to pretend you're a police officer? Join the police force. But this wacky, creepy civilian interest in guns and military gear, when you're not interested in actually serving in the military or joining the police force, something's wrong. And these kinds of red flags, cruelty, kids that injure animals, bullying in schools, interest in these dark video games and things where we just act inappropriately. These should be considered red flags. And there has to be some kind of protocol in place where people who do these things can be reported and investigated, because these problems have to be prevented. We're not going to give teachers guns. We're not going to leave ourselves dependent on police officers and just let all these red flags go and let all these dangers exist and try to fight them off when they finally explode in our faces. The problems of these schools are known. We know that these schools are unhealthy. We know that these schools are inefficient. We know that these schools are unproductive. We know that these schools are centers of all kinds of social evils. We know that these schools are targeted by angry, suicidal people who are able to go and purchase military-grade weapons that no one is going to stop in the event of a shooting. We know all of these dangers, and we continue down this path like fools. And then when the tragedies happen, and I'm sorry if this is offensive, but parents pretend to be shocked and upset because they're not shocked. And you can tell they're not shocked by the things that they say. I can't believe that this happened here. What do you mean you can't believe it happened here? You can't believe what happened here? Another shooting? What parents say, what teachers and school administrators and police officers say, what politicians say, reveals that they already know this is a danger. But the alternative is something that they are simply not willing to listen to, because they are going to continue supporting these schools. They're going to continue building these schools, maintaining these schools. They don't care about the disease vulnerabilities. They don't care about the social evils that they are the sources of. They don't care about the physical dangers that these schools are now known to present to our communities. These schools, especially public schools, these schools are the sources of their convenient lifestyles. And they are not going to continue. They are not going to consider an alternative. And so when these tragedies happen, we can't play this fake game of emotions, yelling at politicians that they didn't do enough, or this. I'd be the first person to argue that civilians should not have guns. That's my personal belief, and I've talked about that elsewhere. But I also believe that we should, as a society, move on from centralized schools. They're not necessary, they're not effective, they're not affordable or sustainable. And increasingly, as if those things wouldn't be convincing enough, increasingly with time, they become greater and greater vulnerabilities in our communities. They're disasters waiting to happen, and they're not necessary. We see the church, unfortunately, doing the same thing, moving from smaller, localized parishes to larger mega parishes, and it's going to create the same vulnerability in the future. We're going to have no mass during disease outbreaks because we're gathering 1,000 people together into a sanctuary from miles and miles across a county or in a populated city, when we don't need to do this. We're going to have these mega parishes be easy targets for anti-Catholic activists. We just had this warning when the leak about the overturning of Roe versus Wade was going through the news, that Catholic churches might see violence or vandalism from pro-abortion or pro-choice political activists. Well, we're making this easy for them by centralizing our parishes, building mega parishes. We make it very easy to target us. If some maniac wants to blow up a bomb and kill lots of Catholics, we're making it very convenient to do so, because we're going to all gather in one place. You could take us all out in one shot. Diseases can spread through the whole Catholic community easily. because we're all going to gather together in one central location when we already know that this is unhealthy. And we saw it in COVID, where many places went a whole year without even being able to have a public mass. And we're just going down that path as if we don't see the red flags. But as for this talk, what we see is that schools are obsolete. Schools are outdated. Parents need to realize this, and they need to learn about how to move forward, how to move on from schools, how to look more practically and realistically at homeschooling. Not that you're going to set yourself up like a teacher in Little House on the Prairie, or like your school teacher when you were a kid. That's not what homeschooling's about. There are incredible resources available. There are expert teachers available to work with your children. There are incredible resources available to your family for very small fees. Like I said, the Classical Liberal Arts Academy costs a family only $10 per month per student. You have to learn to think about homeschooling not as a way to have a 1980s education at home, but as a completely new way to provide for the education of your children. Very flexible, robust, convenient, affordable. You need to learn what homeschooling actually is and not allow some stereotype to live in your mind that actually isn't true. And if you don't start learning about education in the 21st century, you're going to end up having to deal with problems. And I'm not talking about school shootings. You're going to have to deal with other problems, costs, sicknesses, other issues that are related to this idea of centralized schooling that are not necessary. And I know that people are going to talk about them and all as if they're just unavoidable. But it's not true. They are avoidable. They're not explicable anymore. They're not defensible anymore. And I encourage you to make the effort and take the time to learn more about educational options for your children in the 21st century. Because schools are obsolete and we need to move on.